The ancient bells of Valdoria Castle had not rung in mourning for 3 centuries. Yet as dawn broke over the kingdom's capital, their haunting toll echoed across the marble courtyards and through the gilded halls, announcing what palace officials refused to speak aloud. Princess Charlotte Elizabeth, heir to the throne and beloved daughter of King Edmund, had vanished without a trace. In the shadows of the royal corridors, whispers traveled faster than the morning light. The Queen Consort Isabel's eldest son from her previous marriage, Prince Marcus Ashford, had been stripped of his honorary title of Duke of Westmere by the royal guard themselves, an unprecedented action that sent shockwaves through the noble houses. The timing was no coincidence. 48 hours had passed since anyone had seen the princess, and the kingdom's most trusted protectors had taken matters into their own hands. What dark secrets lay buried beneath the crown's glittering facade? What had Marcus done to warrant such swift and severe punishment from the very guard sworn to protect the royal family? And, most urgently, where was Princess Charlotte? And what did her disappearance have to do with the man who had once called her sister? As the kingdom held its breath, waiting for answers that might never come, one truth became clear. The House of Valdoria would never be the same again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Castle as Lady Margaret Thornfield, the princess's personal aide, knocked softly on Charlotte's bedroom door. It was 7 o'clock sharp, the same time she had awakened the princess every day for the past 5 years. But this morning, silence greeted her gentle rap. "Your Highness," Margaret called softly, pressing her ear to the ornate wooden door. "The Queen Consort is expecting you for breakfast in 30 minutes. Still nothing." Margaret's heart began to quicken. Princess Charlotte was many things, spirited, independent, occasionally rebellious, but she was never late for family obligations. The 18-year-old heir to the throne took her duties seriously, perhaps too seriously for someone her age. Margaret tried the handle. Locked. This was unusual, but not unheard of. Charlotte valued her privacy, especially since the recent tensions in the royal family had reached a breaking point. The princess had grown increasingly distant from her stepbrother Marcus, whose ambitions for power had become impossible to ignore. "Princess Charlotte, please respond," Margaret called again, this time with more urgency. When silence continued to be her only answer, she retrieved her master key from the ring at her waist. The door swung open to reveal a room that looked as if a storm had passed through it. Charlotte's bed was unmade, but not in the usual way of someone who had simply risen and left. The covers were twisted and thrown aside as if she had left in great haste. Her nightgown lay crumpled on the floor near the window, which stood wide open despite the autumn chill that had settled over the kingdom. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she noticed something that made her blood run cold. 3 drops of blood stained the white marble windowsill, dark red against the pristine stone. She rushed to the window and looked down at the gardens 3 stories below. The carefully manicured hedges showed no signs of disturbance, no broken branches or disturbed earth that might indicate someone had fallen or jumped. But the blood told a different story entirely. With trembling hands, Margaret pulled the emergency cord that would summon the royal guard immediately. Within moments, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the corridors as Captain William Darrow and his men responded to the call. Captain Darrow was a man who had served 3 generations of Valdorian royalty. His weathered face had seen palace intrigue, assassination attempts, and political upheavals, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw in Princess Charlotte's room that morning. His trained eyes immediately catalogued every detail. The open window, the blood, the signs of struggle, and, most telling of all, the absence of Charlotte's personal jewelry box, which had contained not just priceless gems, but also private letters and documents. "When did you last see the princess?" Captain Darrow asked Margaret, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Yesterday evening, around 9 o'clock. She dismissed me for the night, and said she wanted to read before sleeping. She seemed troubled, but not unusually so." The family dinner had been tense again. Captain Darrow nodded grimly. The family dinners had indeed been increasingly strained. Ever since Queen Consort Isabel had married King Edmund 5 years ago, bringing her son Marcus into the royal household, the dynamics had grown complicated. Marcus, now 25, had never fully accepted his position as stepson to the king. He wanted more than the honorary titles and ceremonial duties he had been granted. "Has anyone informed their majesties?" Captain Darrow inquired. "No, sir. I came directly to you, as protocol demands." Captain Darrow appreciated Margaret's adherence to proper procedures. In situations involving potential threats to the royal family, the royal guard was to be notified before anyone else, including the monarchs themselves. This allowed them to assess the situation and determine the appropriate level of response before panic could spread through the palace. Secure this room immediately. No one enters without my direct permission, Captain Darrow ordered his men. Begin a systematic search of the entire castle grounds. Check every room, every corridor, every servant's quarter. Look for signs of forced entry, unusual disturbances, or anything out of place. As his guards dispersed to carry out his orders, Captain Darrow remained in Charlotte's room, studying the scene with the methodical approach that had made him one of the kingdom's most trusted protectors. The blood on the windowsill was still relatively fresh, meaning Charlotte's disappearance had likely occurred sometime during the night or early morning hours. But something troubled him more than the physical evidence. Yesterday evening, he had witnessed a heated argument between Marcus and Charlotte in the castle's library. Their voices had been raised enough that several servants had taken notice, though none could make out the exact words being exchanged. The argument had ended with Charlotte storming out, and Marcus remaining behind, his face dark with anger. Captain Darrow had made a mental note of the incident, but had not considered it particularly serious at the time. The step-siblings had been clashing frequently in recent months, their relationship deteriorating as Marcus grew more vocal about his desire for greater authority within the kingdom. Charlotte, as the legitimate heir, had little patience for what she saw as Marcus's inappropriate ambitions. Now, in light of Charlotte's disappearance, that argument took on a much more sinister significance. The captain's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of King Edmund himself. The monarch appeared in the doorway, his face pale, and his usually perfectly groomed appearance disheveled. He had clearly dressed hastily after being awakened with news of his daughter's disappearance. "Captain, please tell me this is some kind of mistake," King Edmund said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that Captain Darrow had never heard before. "I'm afraid not, Your Majesty. Princess Charlotte is missing, and there are signs that suggest she did not leave voluntarily." King Edmund's legs seemed to give way beneath him, and he grasped the doorframe for support. Charlotte was not just his heir, she was the light of his life, the daughter who had brought him joy even during the darkest periods of his reign. The thought of anything happening to her was almost too much to bear. "Have you questioned the servants? The guards? Surely someone must have seen something," the king said, his voice gaining strength as his paternal instincts overrode his initial shock. "We've begun a comprehensive investigation, Your Majesty. Every person who was in the castle last night will be questioned thoroughly. We will find the princess." But even as Captain Darrow spoke these reassuring words, a cold dread was settling in his chest. In his 25 years of service to the crown, he had learned to trust his instincts, and those instincts were telling him that Charlotte's disappearance was not the work of outside forces. The castle's security was too tight, the guard rotations too well organized for strangers to have penetrated their defenses without detection. This was an inside job, and Captain Darrow had a growing suspicion about who might be responsible. As the morning wore on, and search teams combed every inch of the castle and grounds, one crucial piece of information emerged that confirmed Captain Darrow's worst fears. Marcus Ashford was nowhere to be found. His personal servant reported that his bed had not been slept in, and his horse was missing from the royal stables. The timing was too coincidental to ignore. On the same night that Princess Charlotte disappeared, her stepbrother had also vanished without explanation. Captain Darrow knew he had to act quickly before the situation spiraled beyond his control. He gathered his most trusted lieutenants in the castle's war room, a secure chamber where sensitive royal business was conducted away from potential eavesdroppers. The men who assembled there were veterans of palace security, individuals who had proven their loyalty to the crown beyond question. "Gentlemen," Captain Darrow began, his voice grave, "we are facing a crisis that threatens the very foundation of our kingdom. Princess Charlotte's disappearance appears to be connected to Prince Marcus's simultaneous absence from the castle. While we cannot yet prove his involvement, the evidence suggests we may be dealing with a kidnapping orchestrated from within our own walls." The implications of his words hung heavy in the air. If Marcus was indeed responsible for Charlotte's disappearance, it represented not just a crime against the princess, but an act of treason against the crown itself. The punishment for such an offense was severe, and the political ramifications could destabilize the entire kingdom. "What are your orders, Captain?" asked Lieutenant Pierce, a man whose loyalty to the royal family was absolute. We proceed with utmost caution but decisive action. Issue a warrant for Prince Marcus's immediate arrest on suspicion of kidnapping and treason. All units are to be on high alert for any sign of him or the princess. And, gentlemen, Captain Darrow paused, his expression becoming even more serious. This information does not leave this room until I give express permission. We cannot afford to create panic among the nobility or the general population until we have more concrete evidence. As his men dispersed to carry out their orders, Captain Darrow remained behind to consider the complex web of palace politics that had led to this moment. Marcus's resentment toward his position in the royal hierarchy had been building for years. As the son of Queen Consort Isabel from her previous marriage, he held honorary titles and enjoyed the privileges of royal life. But he had no real claim to the throne or meaningful political power. Charlotte, on the other hand, was King Edmund's only child and the undisputed heir to the crown. Her position was secure by both law and tradition, something that clearly frustrated Marcus, who felt his own noble birth and capabilities should entitle him to more than ceremonial roles. The captain had observed Marcus's growing bitterness over the years, watching as the young man's initial attempts to ingratiate himself with his stepfather gradually gave way to barely concealed hostility toward the royal hierarchy that kept him in a subordinate position. But Captain Darrow had never imagined that Marcus's resentment would lead him to take such drastic action. If his suspicions proved correct, Marcus had crossed a line from which there could be no return. By taking Charlotte, he had not only committed a heinous crime, but had also exposed the deep fractures within the royal family that could tear the kingdom apart. As the sun reached its zenith and the search for Princess Charlotte entered its second day, Captain Darrow made a decision that would change the course of Valdorian history. He would strip Marcus of his title and declare him an enemy of the crown, sending a clear message that no one, regardless of their connection to the royal family, was above the law. The kingdom's fate now hung in the balance, dependent on finding Charlotte, and bringing Marcus to justice before their family's private tragedy became a national catastrophe. The great hall of Valdoria Castle had never felt so oppressive. Queen Consort Isabel sat rigidly in her chair, her usually perfect composure cracking as Captain Darrow delivered news that would shatter her world. Her son Marcus had been officially declared a fugitive, stripped of his title as Duke of Westmere, and wanted for questioning in connection with Princess Charlotte's disappearance. "This is preposterous," Isabel said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Marcus would never harm Charlotte. They may have their disagreements, but he loves her like a sister." Captain Darrow maintained his respectful but firm stance. "Your Majesty, I understand this is difficult to accept, but the evidence cannot be ignored. Prince Marcus disappeared on the same night as Princess Charlotte. His horse is missing from the stables, and multiple witnesses confirm he had a heated argument with the princess just hours before her disappearance." King Edmund, who had aged years in the span of 2 days, looked at his wife with eyes that held both love and growing suspicion. The revelation about Marcus had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about the family he had tried so hard to unite after marrying Isabel. "Isabel," the king said softly, "we must consider all possibilities. If Marcus has taken Charlotte, every moment we delay could put our daughter in greater danger." The queen consort's face went white. The implication in her husband's words was clear. He was beginning to believe that her son might be capable of such a terrible act. The unity they had worked so hard to build as a blended family was crumbling before their eyes. "I know my son," Isabel insisted, rising from her chair with shaking hands. "Marcus is ambitious, yes, but he is not a criminal. There must be another explanation." Captain Darrow had spent the previous night gathering intelligence from every corner of the castle. What he had discovered painted a troubling picture of Marcus's state of mind in the weeks leading up to Charlotte's disappearance. Servants reported that he had been meeting secretly with various nobles who were known to harbor resentments against King Edmund's policies. Kitchen staff mentioned overhearing conversations about necessary changes and seizing opportunities. Most damning of all was testimony from the castle's librarian, an elderly man named Theodore who had served the royal family for over 30 years. Theodore reported that Marcus had been researching obscure laws regarding succession and inheritance, specifically focusing on circumstances under which a stepchild might inherit the throne if the legitimate heir was declared unfit or unavailable. "Your Majesty," Captain Darrow continued, addressing the king directly, "we have reason to believe this may be part of a larger conspiracy." Prince Marcus has been meeting with individuals who have expressed opposition to Princess Charlotte's eventual succession. There are indications that he may have been planning to challenge her claim to the throne. This revelation hit King Edmund like a physical blow. The idea that Marcus might have orchestrated Charlotte's disappearance as part of a political scheme to seize power was almost too terrible to contemplate. It transformed what he had hoped might be a family dispute into something far more sinister, an attempted coup disguised as a kidnapping. If this is true, King Edmund said, his voice growing harder, then Marcus has not only betrayed our family but committed treason against the crown itself. Captain, I want every resource at your disposal dedicated to finding my daughter and bringing Marcus to justice. As the royal couple grappled with this devastating turn of events, Captain Darrow's investigation was expanding beyond the castle walls. His network of informants throughout the kingdom was being activated, and reports were beginning to filter in from various sources. An innkeeper in the village of Millbrook, located 50 miles southeast of the capital, reported that a young man matching Marcus's description had stopped at his establishment in the early morning hours, accompanied by a hooded figure who never spoke. The man had paid in gold and requested rooms for several days, claiming he and his companion were traveling merchants seeking to avoid the main roads due to bandits. Another lead came from a farmer near the border with the neighboring kingdom of Ashvale. He had seen two riders heading toward the mountain passes that led into foreign territory. One rider, he noted, had been wearing the distinctive blue cloak favored by Valdorian nobility. These sightings painted a picture of Marcus fleeing the kingdom with Charlotte as his prisoner, but Captain Darrow was too experienced to accept these reports at face value. In his years of service, he had learned that initial witness accounts were often unreliable, colored by excitement, fear, or the desire to be helpful. He needed concrete evidence before he could act decisively. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Charlotte's personal maid, Elena, who had been too frightened to speak openly until Captain Darrow interviewed her privately in the castle's chapel, away from other servants who might spread gossip. The princess was planning something, Elena revealed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She had been collecting information about Prince Marcus for weeks. She found letters in his room, documents that she said proved he was plotting against the king. Captain Darrow leaned forward, his attention completely focused on the young woman's words. What kind of documents? Correspondence with lords from the eastern provinces, men who have been vocal about their concerns regarding a female heir. The princess found evidence that Prince Marcus had been promising them positions in his government once he became king. This revelation changed everything. If Charlotte had discovered Marcus's treasonous activities, it provided a clear motive for her stepbrother to take drastic action. She had become a threat to his plans, and removing her would serve the dual purpose of eliminating a witness to his conspiracy while clearing his path to the throne. Did the princess share this information with anyone else? Captain Darrow asked. Elena shook her head. She said she needed to gather more evidence before presenting it to the king. She was afraid that accusations against Prince Marcus would tear the royal family apart, especially since he is Queen Isabel's son. Captain Darrow felt a cold chill run down his spine. Charlotte's loyalty to her family and her desire to protect her stepmother's feelings had likely sealed her fate. If she had immediately reported Marcus's treasonous activities to her father, the situation might have been resolved through political means. Instead, her attempt to gather additional evidence had given Marcus time to realize his secret had been discovered and take action to protect himself. The captain's investigation took on new urgency as he began to piece together the full scope of Marcus's conspiracy. Using the information provided by Elena, he was able to identify several nobles who had been in secret communication with the wayward prince. Arrest warrants were issued, and, within hours, 3 conspirators had been taken into custody. Under interrogation, one of the conspirators, Lord Aldrich of Eastmoor, revealed details that confirmed Captain Darrow's worst fears. Marcus had indeed been planning to stage a coup, but Charlotte's discovery of his activities had forced him to accelerate his timeline. The original plan had been to wait until after King Edmund's death to challenge Charlotte's succession, but her investigation had made immediate action necessary. The prince said the princess had become too dangerous to leave free. Lord Aldrich confessed, his face pale with terror at the implications of his involvement. He claimed that eliminating her was the only way to save the kingdom from the chaos that would follow a weak female ruler. Captain Darrow's jaw tightened as he heard these words. Marcus had justified kidnapping his own stepsister by portraying it as an act of patriotism, convincing himself and his conspirators that Charlotte's removal was necessary for the greater good of Valdoria. Where has he taken her? Captain Darrow demanded. I don't know, Lord Aldrich insisted. The prince said it was safer if we didn't know the details. He promised that the princess would not be harmed if she agreed to renounce her claim to the throne and support his succession. This information provided both hope and additional cause for concern. If Marcus truly intended to secure Charlotte's cooperation rather than simply eliminate her, it meant she was likely still alive. However, it also suggested that he was prepared to hold her indefinitely until she agreed to his demands, and Charlotte's stubborn nature made it unlikely she would ever willingly abdicate her birthright. As night fell on the second day of Charlotte's disappearance, Captain Darrow assembled his most trusted agents for a critical planning session. The investigation had revealed the scope of Marcus's conspiracy, but they were still no closer to finding the princess herself. We know Marcus is moving toward the Ashvale border, Captain Darrow told his men. Our best intelligence suggests he's using the old smuggler's routes through the Thornwood Mountains. These paths are treacherous and rarely traveled, which would explain why we haven't received more sighting reports. Lieutenant Pierce studied the maps spread across the table. If he's heading for Ashvale, he might be planning to seek asylum there. Their king has no love for Valdoria, and harboring a pretender to our throne would serve his political interests. Captain Darrow nodded grimly. King Roderick of Ashvale had indeed been seeking ways to weaken Valdoria's influence in the region, and supporting Marcus's claim to the throne would create chaos that could be exploited. If Marcus reached Ashvale territory with Charlotte as his prisoner, the situation would become infinitely more complicated. We have perhaps 18 hours before Marcus reaches the border, Captain Darrow calculated. After that, any rescue attempt becomes an international incident rather than a domestic law enforcement matter. The pressure was mounting not just from the time constraint, but from within the castle itself. Word of Charlotte's disappearance and Marcus's involvement had begun to spread despite efforts to maintain secrecy. Nobles were arriving at court demanding explanations, and rumors were running wild through the capital city. Queen Consort Isabel had locked herself in her chambers, refusing to see anyone except her personal confessor. The revelation of her son's treachery had devastated her, destroying the life she had built as part of the royal family. King Edmund, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain the appearance of control while privately grappling with the possibility that he might never see his daughter alive again. As Captain Darrow prepared to lead a pursuit force into the mountains, he received an unexpected visitor. Theodore, the elderly librarian, approached him with a leather-bound journal in his hands. Captain, the old man said, his voice urgent, I found this hidden in Prince Marcus's chambers. I believe it may help you understand his state of mind, and perhaps predict his actions. The journal contained Marcus's private thoughts over the past 6 months, written in his own hand. As Captain Darrow read the entries, a disturbing portrait emerged of a young man whose resentment and ambition had gradually consumed his capacity for reason and family loyalty. The early entries revealed Marcus's frustration with his position in the royal hierarchy, but they also showed genuine affection for Charlotte and respect for King Edmund. However, as the months progressed, the tone shifted dramatically. Marcus began to view Charlotte not as a sister, but as an obstacle to his destiny. He convinced himself that Valdoria needed strong male leadership, and that his noble birth gave him the right to rule. The final entries were particularly chilling. Marcus had written extensively about his belief that eliminating Charlotte was not just politically necessary, but morally justified. He had convinced himself that her eventual rule would lead to national weakness, and that taking action against her was his patriotic duty. He's not planning to release her, Captain Darrow realized with growing horror. Even if she agrees to renounce her claim, he sees her as too dangerous to leave alive. This revelation transformed the rescue mission into a race against time. Charlotte's life depended not just on finding her before Marcus reached foreign territory, but on reaching her before he decided that her continued existence posed an unacceptable threat to his ambitions. As dawn broke on the third day of Princess Charlotte's disappearance, Captain Darrow led a force of 50 mounted guards toward the Thornwood Mountains. They carried with them not just the hope of rescuing the princess, but the weight of preventing a family tragedy from becoming a national catastrophe that could destabilize the kingdom for generations to come. The Thornwood Mountains rose like jagged teeth against the gray dawn sky as Captain Darrow's pursuit force pressed deeper into the treacherous terrain. The ancient smugglers' paths they followed were barely visible, winding through dense forests and across rocky outcroppings that could hide a dozen men or conceal the signs of recent passage. Marcus had chosen his route well. The Thornwood had been the domain of bandits and outcasts for centuries, its twisted paths known only to those who lived outside the law. For someone fleeing justice, it provided the perfect escape route, but it also presented deadly challenges that could claim the lives of both pursuer and pursued. Captain Darrow rode at the head of his column, his experienced eyes scanning the ground for any sign of their quarry. Behind him, 50 of Valdoria's finest guards followed in grim silence, each man understanding that they were not merely chasing a criminal but racing to prevent a catastrophe that could tear their kingdom apart. The first real trace of Marcus's passage came at midday, when they discovered the remains of a hastily abandoned campsite hidden in a grove of ancient oaks. The ashes were still warm, indicating that their quarry was perhaps only hours ahead of them. More importantly, Captain Darrow found evidence that confirmed his worst fears about Charlotte's condition. Torn strips of fabric that matched the princess's nightgown were tied to nearby trees, clearly placed as markers. But these were not signals left by Charlotte herself. They were positioned too high for someone of her height to reach, and the deliberate spacing suggested they were meant to mock her rescuers rather than guide them. "He's playing games with us," Lieutenant Pierce observed, his voice tight with anger as he examined the fabric strips. Captain Darrow nodded grimly. Marcus's journal had revealed a mind that had grown increasingly unstable, and these taunting markers suggested that his grip on sanity was deteriorating further under the stress of his flight. A rational kidnapper would have tried to conceal his trail, but Marcus seemed to be deliberately leaving clues that would draw his pursuers deeper into the dangerous mountain passes. As the pursuit force pressed on, they began to encounter more elaborate signs of Marcus's psychological warfare. At one point, they found Charlotte's tiara hanging from a branch over a precipitous cliff, positioned so that any attempt to retrieve it would risk falling to one's death. Later, they discovered one of her shoes placed carefully in the center of a path that led directly into a maze of dead-end ravines. Each of these cruel markers told Captain Darrow that Marcus was not simply fleeing with his prisoner, but was actively trying to demoralize and delay his pursuers. The systematic nature of these psychological attacks suggested careful planning, which meant Marcus had been preparing for this eventuality long before Charlotte discovered his conspiracy. The trail led them higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and the paths more treacherous. Here, among the snow-capped peaks and howling winds, the pursuit force began to understand the true danger of their mission. This was not merely a matter of catching a fleeing criminal. They were venturing into a landscape that had claimed countless lives over the centuries. As evening approached, Captain Darrow called a halt at a sheltered overhang that provided some protection from the mountain winds. His men were exhausted from the grueling pace, and their horses were beginning to show signs of strain from the difficult terrain. But rest was a luxury they could barely afford. "We're gaining on them," Captain Darrow told his assembled officers, studying the map by flickering torchlight. "Marcus is traveling with a prisoner, which slows his progress, and he's taking unnecessary risks to leave his taunting messages. If we maintain our pace, we should catch up to them before they reach the border." Lieutenant Pierce looked troubled. "Sir, what if this is exactly what he wants? What if he's deliberately drawing us into an ambush?" The possibility had occurred to Captain Darrow as well. Marcus had demonstrated careful planning and psychological cunning throughout his conspiracy. It would be entirely consistent with his character to have prepared contingencies for the possibility of pursuit. The mountain passes offered countless opportunities for ambush, and a small group could easily hold off a larger force in such terrain. "We proceed with caution," Captain Darrow decided, "but we cannot allow that possibility to slow our advance. Every hour we delay increases the risk to Princess Charlotte's life." As his men settled in for a few hours of rest, Captain Darrow remained awake, studying the intelligence reports that had reached him through swift messengers from the capital. The political situation in Valdoria was deteriorating rapidly as news of the royal family's crisis spread throughout the kingdom. Several of the eastern provinces had declared their support for Marcus's claim to the throne, citing concerns about female succession and the need for strong leadership during troubled times. These were the same nobles who had been part of Marcus's original conspiracy, but their public declarations of support suggested that the plot extended further than initially suspected. Meanwhile, the western provinces and the merchant guilds had rallied behind Princess Charlotte's legitimate claim, condemning Marcus's actions and demanding his immediate arrest. The kingdom was effectively splitting into two factions, with the potential for civil war growing stronger with each passing hour. King Edmund had been forced to mobilize additional military units to maintain order in the capital, where crowds had gathered demanding news about the princess's fate. Queen Consort Isabel had finally emerged from her chambers to publicly denounce her son's actions and call for Charlotte's safe return. But her statement had done little to calm the growing tensions. The reports painted a picture of a kingdom on the brink of chaos, held together only by the hope that Princess Charlotte would be found alive and Marcus brought to justice. The failure of Captain Darrow's mission would not just mean the loss of the princess. It could trigger a civil conflict that would devastate Valdoria for years to come. As dawn broke on the 4th day of Charlotte's captivity, the pursuit force resumed their climb through increasingly treacherous terrain. The paths here were little more than ledges carved into the rock face, with sheer drops on one side and towering cliffs on the other. Progress was slow and nerve-wracking, but Captain Darrow could sense they were closing in on their quarry. The breakthrough came at midday when they encountered a local mountain guide who had witnessed something extraordinary the previous evening. The man, a weather-beaten hunter named Garrett, had seen 2 riders attempting to navigate the Devil's Staircase, a notorious section of the mountain trail that was considered nearly impassable. One of them riders was having a terrible time of it, Garrett reported, his mountain accent thick, but his meaning clear. Kept fighting with his companion, trying to break free. The other one had to use rope to keep them together. Nearly lost them both going around Widow's Turn. This description confirmed that Charlotte was indeed still alive and attempting to escape from Marcus's control. The fact that he had been forced to restrain her physically suggested that she had not given up hope and was still fighting for her freedom. It also indicated that Marcus was finding it increasingly difficult to control his prisoner while navigating the dangerous mountain terrain. "How far ahead are they?" Captain Darrow asked urgently. Garrett scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. "Hard to say for certain, but if they're still on the Devil's Staircase, you might catch them before they reach the Ashvale border. Of course, that's assuming they don't kill themselves trying to get across Eagle's Gap." Eagle's Gap was legendary among mountain travelers as one of the most dangerous passes in the entire Thornwood Range. It consisted of a narrow bridge of stone that spanned a deep chasm, with winds so fierce that they could blow a horse and rider off the path without warning. Many experienced mountaineers had perished attempting to cross it, and the idea of Marcus trying to navigate it with an unwilling prisoner filled Captain Darrow with dread. The pursuit force pressed on with renewed urgency, abandoning caution in their desperate race to reach Charlotte before Marcus could either complete his escape or meet his death in the treacherous mountain passes. The irony was not lost on Captain Darrow that the same terrain that made Marcus's escape possible might also become his tomb. As they climbed higher, the evidence of Marcus's deteriorating situation became more apparent. They found abandoned supplies, suggesting that he had been forced to lighten his load to maintain speed. More troubling were the signs of conflict: torn clothing, disturbed ground, and what appeared to be bloodstains on the rocks. Charlotte was clearly fighting for her life, but her resistance was taking a toll on both captive and captor. Marcus's carefully planned escape was becoming a desperate flight that was pushing both of them to the limits of their endurance. Late in the afternoon, Captain Darrow's force finally caught sight of their quarry. Far ahead, barely visible on a distant ledge, 2 figures were struggling across what could only be the approach to Eagle's Gap. Even at this distance, it was clear that one figure was trying to break free while the other fought to maintain control. "There!" Lieutenant Pierce shouted, pointing toward the distant figures. "We can see them." But even as relief flooded through the pursuit force at finally locating their target, Captain Darrow realized they faced a terrible dilemma. Marcus was approaching the most dangerous section of the mountain pass, where a rescue attempt could easily result in Charlotte's death if it caused him to lose his footing or make a desperate decision. As they watched in horror from their distant vantage point, they could see Marcus dragging Charlotte toward the narrow stone bridge that spanned Eagle's Gap. The wind was howling across the chasm with such force that even from miles away, they could hear its ominous roar. Captain Darrow knew they had reached the critical moment of their mission. Within the next few hours, Princess Charlotte would either be rescued alive, die in Marcus's custody, or perish with her captor in the unforgiving embrace of the Thornwood Mountains. The fate of the kingdom hung in the balance, suspended like the treacherous bridge that now represented their final hope for saving both the princess and the realm she was destined to rule. The wind across Eagle's Gap screamed with the fury of ancient gods, threatening to tear away anything foolish enough to challenge its dominance. Captain Darrow and his men had dismounted and were now climbing on foot, using ropes and pitons to secure themselves against the treacherous mountain face as they closed the final distance to where Marcus held Princess Charlotte captive. Through his spyglass, Captain Darrow could see the desperate situation unfolding on the stone bridge ahead. Marcus had Charlotte tied with rope around her waist, but her resistance was making their progress across the narrow span both slow and dangerous. Every few steps, the princess would try to break free or throw herself toward the edge, apparently preferring the risk of death to continued captivity. The sight of Charlotte's defiance filled Captain Darrow with both pride and terror. Her refusal to surrender, even in the face of almost certain death, demonstrated the courage that would make her a worthy queen. But her desperate struggles were forcing Marcus into increasingly erratic behavior, and the captain could see that his quarry was approaching a breaking point. As they drew closer, voices began to carry on the mountain wind. Marcus was shouting at Charlotte, his words barely audible over the howling air, but his tone conveyed frustration and rage. The princess's responses were equally fierce, though Captain Darrow could not make out her exact words. What was clear was that she was refusing to cooperate with whatever demands Marcus was making. Lieutenant Pierce, climbing beside Captain Darrow, gestured toward a position where they might be able to intercept Marcus before he completed the crossing. "Sir, if we can get ahead of them to the other side of the gap, we can trap him on the bridge." It was a dangerous plan, but Captain Darrow realized it might be their only option. The alternative was to confront Marcus while he still had room to maneuver, which could result in him throwing Charlotte off the bridge in a final act of spite. If they could position themselves to block his escape route, they might force a surrender without additional violence. "Take 10 men and make your way around the eastern approach," Captain Darrow ordered. "I'll advance directly with the remaining force. Whatever happens, our priority is Princess Charlotte's safety, even if it means allowing Marcus to escape." As Lieutenant Pierce and his squad began their treacherous journey to outflank Marcus, Captain Darrow led the main force in a direct approach to Eagle's Gap. With each step, the danger increased not just from the terrain but from the growing instability of their target. Marcus's voice was becoming increasingly shrill as he struggled to control both Charlotte and his own fear of the deadly crossing. The young man who had once been charming and diplomatic at court functions was now revealed as someone whose sanity had completely unraveled under the pressure of his failed coup attempt. When Captain Darrow finally came close enough to communicate directly, he called out across the wind, his voice carefully modulated to avoid provoking Marcus into rash action. "Prince Marcus, this is Captain Darrow of the Royal Guard. You are surrounded and have nowhere to go. Release Princess Charlotte and surrender yourself, and you will be treated with the mercy due your former position." Marcus's laughter echoed strangely in the mountain air, a sound devoid of humor or hope. "Mercy, Captain? What mercy can there be for someone who dared to claim what was rightfully his? What mercy can there be for someone who saw through the weakness that would have destroyed our kingdom?" "You still have a choice," Captain Darrow replied, edging closer while trying to keep his movements non-threatening. "Princess Charlotte is innocent of any wrongdoing. Whatever grievances you have are with the crown, not with her personally." "Innocent?" Marcus's voice rose to a near shriek. "She is the embodiment of everything wrong with our traditions. A weak female heir who would lead Valdoria to ruin. I tried to save our kingdom from her incompetence, and this is the thanks I receive." Charlotte's voice cut through the wind like a blade. "You tried to commit treason, Marcus. You plotted against my father and endangered our people for your own ambition. You are the one who would have destroyed Valdoria." The exchange revealed the fundamental delusion that had driven Marcus to his desperate actions. He had convinced himself that his treasonous conspiracy was actually an act of patriotism, and Charlotte's refusal to validate this fantasy was pushing him further into madness. Captain Darrow could see that reasoning with Marcus was hopeless. The young man's grip on reality had slipped too far for rational discussion. The only option was to somehow separate him from Charlotte before his instability led to tragedy for both of them. "Marcus," Captain Darrow called out, trying a different approach, "think about your mother. Queen Consort Isabel is heartbroken by what has happened. If you truly care about family, don't force her to lose both her son and her stepdaughter." For a moment, the mention of his mother seemed to reach something human in Marcus's eyes. His grip on Charlotte's rope loosened slightly, and his expression showed a flicker of the pain that lay beneath his madness. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed determination. My mother made her choice when she married King Edmund, Marcus replied bitterly. She chose his crown over her son's destiny. I cannot let sentiment prevent me from doing what must be done. It was then that Captain Darrow realized the full horror of Marcus's intentions. The young man was not planning to escape with Charlotte as his prisoner. He was planning to eliminate her permanently, believing that her death would clear his path to the throne. The crossing of Eagle's Gap was not an escape route. It was an execution ground. You cannot seriously believe that killing Princess Charlotte will make you king, Captain Darrow said, his voice carrying new urgency. The nobles will never accept someone who murdered the rightful heir. Marcus's laugh was filled with bitter triumph. They will have no choice. With Charlotte dead and no other legitimate heirs, the succession will fall to the closest male relative. King Edmund will need a strong successor, and I will be there to provide stability in a time of crisis. The twisted logic of his plan became clear to Captain Darrow. Marcus intended to present Charlotte's death as a tragic accident during an escape attempt, positioning himself as the grieving stepbrother who had tried unsuccessfully to save her. With Charlotte gone and his conspirators already in place among the nobility, he would be positioned to claim the throne as the only viable alternative to civil war. But Charlotte herself was not ready to accept defeat. Eventide and exhausted from days of captivity, she continued to fight against Marcus's control. As they reached the halfway point of the stone bridge, she made one final, desperate attempt to break free. Throwing her weight against the rope that bound her, Charlotte managed to knock Marcus off balance. For a terrifying moment, both figures teetered on the edge of the narrow span, the howling wind threatening to carry them both into the abyss below. Marcus recovered first, his fear of death temporarily overriding his madness. He grabbed Charlotte roughly and slammed her against the stone parapet of the bridge, his face contorted with rage. "You cannot win, Charlotte," he screamed. "Your father's kingdom will be mine, whether you live to see it or not." It was at that moment that Lieutenant Pierce and his men appeared at the far end of the bridge, their crossbows trained on Marcus. The trap was complete, but rather than forcing a surrender, the sight of additional enemies seemed to push Marcus over the final edge of sanity. "So be it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "If I cannot have the crown, then neither can she." With deliberate cruelty, Marcus began to push Charlotte toward the edge of the bridge. But the princess, drawing on reserves of strength and courage that even she had not known she possessed, managed one final act of defiance. Instead of falling to her death as Marcus intended, she grabbed onto his cloak as she went over the edge, dragging her captor with her. For a heart-stopping moment, both figures dangled over the abyss, held only by Marcus's desperate grip on the stone parapet. The irony was perfect and terrible. The man who had planned Charlotte's death now held both their lives in his failing hands. Captain Darrow and his men rushed forward, throwing ropes and grappling hooks in a desperate attempt to save both the princess and her captor. But the stone was slick with ice, Marcus's strength was failing, and the weight of two bodies was more than his grip could support. "Save her," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying a note of genuine remorse as he looked down at Charlotte's terrified face. "Save my sister." In his final moments, some echo of the young man who had once genuinely cared for Charlotte seemed to reassert itself. With his last act of conscious choice, Marcus used what remained of his strength to throw Charlotte toward the reaching hands of Captain Darrow's men, sacrificing his own grip on life to give her one final chance at survival. The rescue was successful by mere inches. Strong hands caught Charlotte's rope and pulled her to safety just as Marcus's hold on the bridge finally failed. His last words were lost in the wind as he fell into the chasm below, taking with him not just his own life, but the treasonous conspiracy that had threatened to tear Valdoria apart. As Captain Darrow helped Charlotte back on a solid ground, the princess was shaking not just from cold and exhaustion but from the trauma of watching someone she had once considered a brother choose to save her life at the cost of his own. The young woman who had been taken from her chamber 4 days earlier was gone forever, replaced by someone who had seen the depths of human ambition and the price of political power. "Is it over?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely a whisper as she collapsed into Captain Darrow's protective embrace. The captain looked out over Eagle's Gap, where the wind still howled with indifferent fury over the abyss that had claimed Marcus's life. "Yes, Your Highness," he replied. "It's over." But even as he spoke these comforting words, Captain Darrow knew that the real challenges were just beginning. Charlotte had been saved, and the immediate threat to her life had been eliminated, But the kingdom Marcus had left behind was still fractured by political divisions and the trauma of royal betrayal. The journey back to Valdoria would be only the first step in healing the wounds that this crisis had inflicted on both the royal family and the realm they served. The great bells of Valdoria Castle rang out across the kingdom for the second time in a week, but their tone had changed from mournful tolling to jubilant celebration. Princess Charlotte had returned home alive, and the news of her rescue spread through the capital like wildfire, bringing crowds into the streets to cheer the resolution of their national crisis. But within the castle walls, the mood was far more complex than simple relief. Charlotte sat in her father's private study, no longer the carefree young woman who had disappeared from her chambers 6 days earlier. The ordeal had aged her in ways that went far beyond the physical exhaustion and minor injuries she had sustained during her captivity. King Edmund studied his daughter's face, seeing new lines of worry and a hardness in her eyes that had not been there before. The naive idealism of youth had been burned away by her confrontation with Marcus's ambition and madness, replaced by a mature understanding of the dangers that surrounded those who held power. "You saved the kingdom," the king said softly, reaching across his desk to take Charlotte's hand. "Your courage and refusal to give in to Marcus's demands prevented a civil war that could have destroyed everything we've built." Charlotte's response revealed the depth of her transformation. "I didn't save anything, father. I merely survived long enough for Captain Darrow and his men to rescue me. The real damage was done long before Marcus took me from my room." She was referring to the political fractures that had emerged during her absence, divisions that would not be easily healed by her safe return. Several noble houses had declared their support for Marcus's conspiracy, revealing long-simmering resentments about female succession and concerns about Valdoria's future. These nobles now faced charges of treason, but their punishment would not eliminate the underlying tensions they represented. Queen Consort Isabel had aged years in the span of a week. The woman who had once moved through court with graceful confidence now seemed fragile and uncertain, haunted by the knowledge that her son had been capable of such terrible betrayal. Her position as queen consort had become almost impossible to maintain, as many viewed her as complicit in Marcus's conspiracy simply by virtue of being his mother. "Isabel wants to abdicate her position and retire to a monastery," King Edmund told Charlotte. "She feels responsible for what Marcus did, and the guilt is consuming her." Charlotte's response surprised her father with its political sophistication. That would be a mistake. Isabel's abdication would be seen as an admission that the royal family was fundamentally flawed. It would validate the concerns of Marcus's supporters and potentially destabilize your own reign. She must remain and demonstrate that the crown stands united despite what has happened. The king marveled at his daughter's insight. 6 days ago, she might have agreed that Isabel should step down as a gesture of accountability. But her experience as Marcus's prisoner had taught her that political gestures, however well-intentioned, could have consequences far beyond their immediate impact. Captain Darrow's investigation into the conspiracy had revealed its true scope, and the findings were deeply troubling. Marcus had been in contact with foreign agents, particularly representatives of King Roderick of Ashvale, who had seen the succession crisis as an opportunity to weaken Valdoria's regional influence. The conspiracy had not been merely a domestic power grab, but part of a broader international plot to destabilize the kingdom. "We've arrested 15 nobles for treason," Captain Darrow reported during a meeting of the Royal Council. "But our intelligence suggests that Marcus's network extended far beyond those who openly supported him. Many others provided information or assistance while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement." The challenge facing the kingdom was how to punish the conspirators without creating additional instability. Executing all 15 nobles would eliminate powerful families and create a vacuum that could be exploited by Valdoria's enemies. But showing too much mercy would be seen as weakness and might encourage future rebellions. Charlotte's proposal demonstrated her emerging political wisdom. "We should distinguish between the leaders and the followers. The 3 nobles who actively recruited others and maintained foreign contacts should face execution for treason. The others should be stripped of their titles and lands but allowed to live, provided they swear new oaths of loyalty and accept permanent exile from court." This approach would eliminate the most dangerous conspirators while offering a path to redemption for those who had been led astray by Marcus's manipulations. It also sent a clear message that treason would be punished severely while leaving room for mercy and political reconciliation. The international implications of the crisis also required careful management. King Roderick of Ashvale had lost his opportunity to install a puppet ruler in Valdoria, but he remained a threat to regional stability. The evidence of his involvement in Marcus's conspiracy provided grounds for diplomatic pressure, but it also risked escalating tensions into open warfare. Charlotte's suggestion for handling this challenge revealed her growing understanding of statecraft. We should present the evidence of Ashvale's involvement to the other regional kingdoms. King Roderick's willingness to support treason and kidnapping makes him a threat to all legitimate monarchs. If we can isolate him diplomatically, we reduce his ability to cause future trouble without resorting to military action. Over the following weeks, Charlotte threw herself into the work of rebuilding the kingdom's stability with an intensity that both impressed and worried her father. She met with loyal nobles to reassure them of the crown's strength, corresponded with foreign dignitaries to explain Valdoria's position, and worked with Captain Darrow to strengthen the kingdom's internal security. But, perhaps most importantly, she began to prepare herself for the responsibilities of queenship with a seriousness that had been lacking before her ordeal. She studied law, economics, and military strategy with her tutors, but she also spent time with common citizens, learning about their concerns and challenges in ways that would make her a more effective ruler. The transformation was remarkable and somewhat heartbreaking to witness. The carefree princess who had once complained about the burdens of royal duty had been replaced by a young woman who understood that the crown was not a privilege but a responsibility that could demand any sacrifice, including one's life. 3 months after her rescue, Charlotte stood before the assembled nobility of Valdoria to deliver a speech that would define her future reign. The occasion was the formal announcement of the punishments for Marcus's conspirators, but her words addressed much broader themes about the nature of leadership and loyalty. The events of recent months have tested our kingdom in ways we never anticipated, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death and emerged stronger. We have seen how ambition without honor can corrupt even those we trust most. We have learned that the stability we take for granted can be shattered by the actions of a few individuals who place personal gain above the common good. The assembled nobles listened in respectful silence as Charlotte continued. But we have also seen the strength that emerges when people choose duty over convenience, when they risk their lives for principles greater than themselves. Captain Darrow and his men demonstrated that courage in their pursuit across the Thornwood Mountains. You have demonstrated it by remaining loyal to the crown despite the chaos that threatened to engulf us all. Her conclusion drew upon the painful lesson of Marcus's final moments on Eagle's Gap. Even in his madness, my stepbrother chose to save my life rather than destroy it. That choice reminds us that redemption is possible even in the darkest circumstances, and that mercy must temper justice if we are to build a kingdom worthy of our people's loyalty. The speech was received with thunderous applause, but Charlotte took no personal satisfaction from the approval. She had learned that popular acclaim was fleeting and that true leadership required making difficult decisions that might not always be well received. In the quiet of her chambers that evening, Charlotte reflected on how completely her life had changed since that terrifying night when Marcus had taken her from her room. The naive young woman who had discovered his treasonous letters was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the crown she would inherit came with burdens that could crush those unprepared to bear them. But she also understood that these burdens were worth accepting because the alternative, allowing the kingdom to fall into chaos or the hands of those who would exploit it for personal gain, was unacceptable. Her people deserved leaders who would sacrifice for their welfare rather than sacrifice them for personal ambition. A year later, when Charlotte was formally invested as heir apparent in a ceremony attended by dignitaries from across the continent, observers noted the profound change in her demeanor. The playful princess had become a serious and capable future queen, someone who commanded respect through her demonstrated courage and wisdom rather than her birthright alone. King Edmund, watching his daughter take her formal oaths of service to the kingdom, felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. Charlotte had grown into the leader that Valdoria needed, but the price of that transformation had been the loss of her innocence and youth. The carefree girl he had raised was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true cost of power and the responsibilities it entailed. Queen Consort Isabel, who had chosen to remain at court despite the painful memories, watched the ceremony with tears in her eyes. Her son's betrayal had cost him his life and nearly destroyed the kingdom, but it had also forged Charlotte into someone who would be strong enough to protect Valdoria from future threats. As the ceremony concluded and Charlotte received the homage of her future subjects, Captain Darrow stood at attention among the royal guards, his weathered face showing quiet satisfaction. The princess he had rescued from Eagle's Gap had become the queen the kingdom needed. His mission was complete, but he knew that Charlotte's true test as a leader still lay ahead. The crisis that had begun with a royal guard stripping Marcus of his title after Charlotte's disappearance had ended with the emergence of a new kind of monarchy, one tempered by hardship and strengthened by the understanding that true power came not from birthright, but from the willingness to serve others before oneself. In the end, Marcus's treacherous conspiracy had achieved the opposite of its intended goal. Instead of weakening Valdoria's future leadership, it had forged a future queen whose courage and wisdom would guide the kingdom through whatever challenges lay ahead. The royal family had been tested by betrayal and tragedy, but they had emerged stronger and more united than ever before.